Thank you so much for the time. How you doing today?
Good. I'm sick of hearing myself talk at the moment, so I'm gearing back up to talk to you. It's been a busy couple days. Good, busy, but better than having nobody, give a hoot about what we've just done. It's a lot better to have it this way. So, no complaints.
Well, I'm a complete nerd for what has been happening with college football over the past
Oh,
5 years.
good. You're
So
right up my alley then.
not only getting to discuss that with you because of who and what you are as an investigative journalist, but you're one of my favorite fellow Armenians around. So
Oh, wow.
we
Thank
talked
you.
we talked several years ago for the Tiger Woods book. So
You looked familiar to me, and I was like, I think I've talked to this guy before. So,
yeah,
yeah, Tiger was 2018. So, we're talking Jesus, almost 6 years ago, 6 years ago, more than six. You're still doing it. That's good.
hanging on for dear life, Armen.
Yeah, aren't we all? I mean,
Yeah, right.
it's not a great time for sports journalism. I can tell you that. You know,
Yeah, broadcasting in general, it's we're at a very weird place right now. Or if you're not able to do at least a little bit of everything, and you're newer to the business, you're maybe SOL.
I think so. It's been really, you watch some of the young people that come into this business. I started, in a weekly newspaper and went to a day, suburban daily to a San Diego Union to Sports Illustrated. So I had a trajectory where I was in the print business, and I could learn and make mistakes and, do it, uh, in some places where they weren't noticed so much. And by the time I got to SI, I knew what I was doing, but there isn't that there isn't that runway anymore, and especially now with um, a lot of people want to come right into the sort of network television world or regional television world without having spent a great deal of time learning the business. And, it shows up sometimes on camera when particularly sometimes I watch sideline reporters and you're just wondering if they've actually watched the game because I can, coach, what does this win mean for your program? I mean, I can get a puppet to say that. So anyways, probably a story for a different day, but it is something that I'm concerned about. And especially when you've lost, we lost real sports, we lost 60-minute sports. E60 is kind of a shell of itself. There's no more Showtime sports. HBO sports is really just now just documentaries. Um, there really isn't anywhere to go to really good storytelling. And I just watched I know quite a bit about the Steve McNair case, more than most people. And I just watched that Steve McNair doc, and it should have been called Retold, not Untold, because there's absolutely nothing in there that they didn't pull out of the police narrative, and they
Oh,
bought that that police BS hook, line, and sinker. So
yeah,
different
even
story.
some of these sports documentaries that surfaced after The Last Dance with Michael Jordan were pure propaganda pieces. Like
Yeah.
that Urban Meyer
Oh,
Netflix series was absurd.
I know. And you look at now, I just noticed yesterday, Netflix is doing this five starters thing with LeBron James, Anthony Edwards, and three other NBA players. And I looked who's who's producing it. It's LeBron James' production company, Barack Obama's production company, and Peyton's production company. So I know for a fact, unless you go into these big streamers now with like Shaquille O'Neal or Barack Obama or LeBron or Steph Curry or you name it, big name Tom Brady, they're just they're just not going to do anything unless there's some big name behind it, because then it gives them an opportunity to say, well, it wasn't successful, but Jesus, who wouldn't be want to do this with these people? It just gives you an automatic out. And unfortunately, right now there's so many good producers, like the plethora of really high quality, award winning, real sports producers that are now looking for work. And if you actually had a streamer that, they have the money, but have the wherewithal and the interest to produce, kind of another real sports kind of storytelling series, I think it would be a hit. But they're just not into that right now. They just rather, like you say, they just rather slap a name on it and have some, like the Roger Federer thing. I didn't learn a thing about Roger Federer that I walked away going, wow, that's really interesting. So
No.
it is what it is.
Yeah, very rarely do you get that. That's why I was excited to see your name attached to this project. Why did you decide that you wanted to focus your efforts on what's currently going on in college football and also looking into the past too to see how we got to the current place that we are with not just college sports, but obviously much more specifically college football with how much money it makes each and every year?
Well, I think for us, I had done a book with Jeff Benedict back in 2013 called The System. And that was at that time, it was a deep dive into the state of college football, which was convulsive at that period of time with realignment had just really broken open again. The college football playoffs were coming. Um, Coaching salaries were skyrocketing, so to speak. But this is like the system 2.0. I mean, what we witnessed back in 2012 is literally child's play compared to what we're dealing with now in the state of college football. And I think that's what the price really does so well. It takes you, behind the scenes, and you can kind of live what the major characters of the book are living with in the cost, not just the financial cost, the price that's being paid there, but the emotional and the psychological and the physical toll that's being taken on people that are really devoting their lives and their livelihoods to college football. So it's interesting, Trey, when the project was presented to me, it originally had Paul Feinbaum's name attached with John Talty. And I knew of John, but I didn't know John. When Paul decided to drop out for various reasons, mainly just time and a little bit of a conflict of interest in places, John and I shared the same literary agent, David Bigliano, who came to me and said, would you be interested in just looking at this proposal because it reminds me of the system? So I looked at it and I liked it. John's a very good writer. I thought I could bring some additional weight and some of the trust and contacts that I had in the game to broaden it out to like Michigan and the NCAA and Arizona and places like that. And so we took it out, and Harper Collins bought it. It's published by Harper. And I really liked it because at this stage of my life, these big sprawling projects that take in a lot of territory, they're complicated. I like to say if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. It's not easy. But because I had certain relationships in certain places and I had built up a level of trust, I could access those relationships to say, hey, can we go behind the scenes with you? Could we get this rare access at Arizona? Could we get it at Michigan? Could we get it at the NCAA headquarters? Can I go behind the scenes with certain collectives? And then you add John's contacts and the reputation that he has and has created in the SEC and nationwide. It was a really good mix. He's about half my age. He reminds me kind of a young me in terms of his relentless reporting, his obsessiveness in terms of getting things right. He's got a very high level of integrity in terms of when he tells me something's on background, I know I can trust that it's on background. When and I was really impressed with his writing too, because there's some chapters in here on Nick Saban, on Kirby, on Jimbo, on Jimmy Sexton that John wrote that are just lights out. I mean, they're so much fun to read because the reporting is so good, and the writing I think is really, really good too. So it makes for a compelling read.
Yeah, and some of this I knew, but there was a lot that I did not. And that includes the background stories of various people and entities like the NCAA. So I knew the NCAA had been around for more than 100 years, being founded in 1906. I didn't really know that it became what it currently is until the mid 1900s, 1951, when they hired a 29-year-old college dropout and former sports writer. Walter Byers was his name, as its first executive director. How would you describe Byers' 36-year tenure with the NCAA?
Well, I would describe it as I say in the book, he ran the NCAA like a third world despot. It was Walter's way or no way. And when I was at Sports Illustrated in the 80s, Walter and the NCAA were they were in Mission, Kansas.
Hmm.
I remember Jack McCallum, a senior writer, and I went there for a story on the NCAA. And I'll never forget, we walked in there and we left. Everybody's desk looked the same. There were no pictures on the desks. There were no papers on the desks. Walter ran it like it was almost like a prison. You couldn't have any sort of personal items on your desk. And I thought, wow, this is a weird place to work. And Walter and I was Jack will still laugh about it. I think I was one of the few people in those days that actually said to Walter, really? Are you going to sell us that line of bullshit? I mean, come on. And you understand, and I've become more educated about it. Walter created the phrase student athlete. And it wasn't because they were student athletes. He created it because as a protection against workers' compensation cases. He created the whole idea of amateurism and sold it, not because he believed in it, because if you read you read his memoir, he talks about that this was just created out of whole cloth and that those words were camouflaged for an economic monopoly. Okay, hello, a cartel. So like you said, I thought it was really interesting, Trey, because when you understand the history of the NCAA, you understand the delay and the denial that they brought into court time and time and time again, challenging the lawsuits that were over athletes' rights or revenue sharing or the whole idea of workers' compensation or employees being paid like other students are on campus. And you take one loss after another and lower courts call you a cartel. And then again, in the end, the Supreme Court rules in 2021, July of 2021, that you are, in essence, a cartel. And this was nothing more than the violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And you were artificially suppressing wages of your employees, of the people that are directly responsible for a vast majority of your revenue. Well, that opened the door to NIL. And after that, the floodgates opened, as you well know. And you combine that with the portal and the massive realignment and everybody now scrambling for themselves, the amount of self-interest involved. And that's where you get the chaos, and that's what we have today. So if I'm inside the sport as a coach, a head coach or athletic director, I'm banging my head against the wall. As a journalist, I'm thinking, wow, this is a really rich landscape to explore. And that's, I think, what John and I are really pleased about, hopping on a speeding freight train, didn't know where it was headed most of the time. And in the end, thank God there was a deadline where John and I would still be reporting this thing because it's changing, every day.
Yes, it is. I can't believe some of the admissions Byers makes about what their true intentions were versus how they were framing things over the course of 30 plus years. I'm actually going to have to get his memoir now so I can read it for myself. But speaking of that Alston versus NCAA case, it was a 9-0 Supreme Court decision, which anybody in their right mind could have seen coming. And look, do I understand the NCAA trying to push things to the Supreme Court to hold off the inevitable? In a way, I do. What is inexcusable to me, Armen, and maybe you agree with me, is that they had no contingency plan in place. They clearly weren't planning for the likelihood that they were going to have to be dealing with NIL. So they got caught completely flat-footed when that decision came down. And college sports, and specifically college football, are still dealing with the ramifications of that today.
There's a section in the book. I went to Indianapolis and I interviewed Greg Shakeen, who ran the NCAA basketball tournament. And I knew Greg because I covered, I think, 7 Final Fours. Terrific guy, was beloved by people that were around basketball because he was a total professional. He tells the story of coming into the awareness of the whole name, image, and likeness, particularly the likeness question. And he looks at a NCAA EA Sports video game, and he looks at it and goes, wait a second, this is Purdue versus, I think it was Illinois. And he's looking at these players, and he knows it because he grew up in the Midwest. He's an Indiana boy. He goes, these are exactly the players that have played in the game. Ed O'Bannon did the same thing in the beginning of the O'Bannon lawsuit. And he goes back, Greg at the time goes back to his bosses at the NCAA and goes, wait a second. This is likeness. We're into some deep water here if somebody decides that they want to sue us over likeness. And the NCAA's response was, likeness is what we say it is. Likeness is what we say it is. And Greg, to his ever loving credit, was starting to have conversations with the student athlete groups, particularly the big one, the national one, and trying to come to some sort of conclusion or early attempt to bring the NCAA into the present day and say, look, we have to come to some sort of compensation here, some sort of comfort level with the athletes. And so they're going to get some money out of this very successful EA sports game, basketball and in football. And the answer was, it was working through Miles Brand, the president at the time, who was asking Greg about this working group that he had together. And then Miles Brand died. And when Miles Brand died, that was the end of the NCAA's attempts to come to some sort of middle ground with athletes on revenue sharing. And once that happened, they went back into the dark ages again. And it was, again, just like you said, no, it's what we say it is, when we say it is. And in the end, that's what we're dealing with now. If the NCAA, if someone said to me, had we taken the air out of this overinflated tire when we had the opportunity, we wouldn't be dealing with what we're dealing with today. And this is Niagara Falls. You know, it was a trickle over the dam before. Now it's Niagara Falls. And you're seeing that no one really knows what to do with it right now because everybody's out for themselves. And you look at the chapter on the destruction of the Pac-12, 108-year-old conference, it's just littered with self-interest and wanton greed. And when that's the operating principle or the operating system for so many people right now, that's not the greater good for the game. And, you know, we explore all of that in the book.
Yeah, Mark Emmert took over after Miles Brand passed away and was in charge for the next 12 years, including through the start of the NIL era. And he has faced a lot of criticism for what he did or didn't do during that time. I've levied a lot of criticism at him. How much of that do you think is warranted versus him just doing the bidding for a lot of university presidents and chancellors behind the scenes?
Well, I've got to give John credit. I know Mark, and I've listened to some of his press conferences at the NCAA conventions and stuff, but John developed a relationship with Mark where Mark was very open with him, and he's a prominent figure in our book. Yeah. And it's clear that he came in believing that he was a change agent, that he could begin to push the association and the membership in certain directions that were realistic in terms of the vast commercialization that the NCAA was experiencing. But, excuse me, very early on, Mark realized what a lot of NCAA presidents have realized. He was banging his head against the wall. And there was resistance on a number of levels. One, the people that were change agents that thought, okay, we should share revenue with the people that are directly responsible in so many ways for enriching us, whether it would have been the SEC or let me just say the Alabamas of the world or the Tennessees of the world. Well, on the other level, you got the Toledos of the world. Excuse me. You have the Western Michigans of the world. They're not operating under the same budget in any way or shape or form that Alabama has that kind of revenue that they could share. Central Michigan's just trying to, they're not breaking even. They're charging student fees. And so they have no extra money to give. And they're resistant to all that change. And because everybody in the NCAA, no matter whether you're at the top of the food chain or at the bottom of the food chain, you all have the same vote. So your vote means the same. And that's one of the problems is the Division threes are voting at the same time the Division ones are. And even in the Division ones, you know, there's those up here and there are those down here, and they don't have the same priorities and they don't have the same interests. And that's a big problem.
No, you look at the meeting of the NCAA institutions that are part of the FBS. I want to say there's 32 different conferences that make that up, but there's really I mean, we could even say three. I guess you can say four, but probably three or more like two that are making all the big decisions, as was shown this summer when the SEC and Big Ten are essentially saying, look, if you want us to remain a part of this organization, you're going to have to guarantee us a certain number of spots in the college football playoff every year, which increases the amount of money that we're making when we already have that significant financial advantage too. So at some point, all of these fractures are going to form great enough to where it just makes more sense. And I realize that Greg Sankey and the other major power brokers in college sports and college football in particular are suggesting that that's a foolish idea. But why would it be a foolish idea? Because a lot of these other schools are playing so far behind the eight ball, they don't have a legitimate chance to win a national championship, even if they get that one guaranteed spot as those secondary schools in the college football playoff every year.
Yeah, I think what they're saying publicly is this is not a great idea because PR wise, it doesn't play very well. You
Yeah.
know, for the SEC or Tony Petitti, who I worked for, I worked under at CBS Sports, who was Sean McManus's right hand man there for years when I was there. They're playing the PR game in a very smart way because the last thing right now, I think, and with all the tumult that's going on and all the confusion going on but they will use that at the proper moment as leverage to say, hey boys, if we don't get what we want, as you just pointed out, more spots in the college football playoffs or a bigger share of the grant of rights money, well, we're just going to break away. And we'll form our own group, our own association with our own rules. We'll be a minor league to the NFL. And, the rest of these sort of enforcement things that we've got to deal with, be damned, we're not going to worry about that. Is that going to happen? If you talk to enough people, there's concerns that could happen, not in the near future, but 5 years from now, down the line, is it possible that we'd see a 64 team conference, East, West, North, South? Yeah, I think we could. And, when you have the media companies making decisions for conferences, as we witnessed firsthand in the destruction of the Pac-12, when USC decided to make that move to the Big Ten, that was the beginning of the end of the Pac-12. And as one ESPN executive said to me, there's no way on God's green earth, essentially, that SC belongs in the Midwest. The only reason they're there is because of the money. And when SC went, obviously UCLA followed. And then now you have the other schools, everybody's looking around going, uh-oh, now what? So Washington and Oregon start to sprinkle out the ideas that they're not exactly afraid to make the move. And Kevin Warren, for all his expertise in the NFL, I think was a really ill-advised choice to be the commissioner of the Big Ten. And he was working really at the behest of Fox. When Fox felt that they had the leverage to bring in Washington and then Oregon, and when you get Oregon, you get Phil Knight and you get Division Street, the Collective, one of the most powerful in the country. You got a super conference. Okay, that's it. That's game, set, and match for the Pac-12. And I know Bobby Robbins, the president of Arizona, worked religiously, maniacally at times to try to hold everything together. But and I won't go all into it, but they were just so, in the chapters entitled Unrealistic, some of those college presidents thought that their grant of rights money was worth $50 million, the same as the Big Ten and the SEC. And they basically got laughed out of the room, and rightly so. As an ESPN executive said to me, he goes, well, if you're talking about swimming and track and field and volleyball, yeah, they are equal. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about football and basketball, and we're primarily talking about football. And there's no way they're on the same ground as the Big Ten and the SEC. So, but none of those college presidents, most of them who know next to nothing about sports and really next to nothing about sports business and sports media rights negotiations, thought they did. And in the end, it was the death knell of a 108-year-old conference. And to me, that is just tragic to lose the Conference of Champions in that kind of a fashion.
Yeah, it is really sad. I'm glad you guys shared the Bobby Robbins side to that story too, because for the longest time I've assumed that it was George Kliavkoff that was making the biggest decisions with regards to forming the alliance, and of course the backstabbing that happens afterwards. It was so clear that Kevin Warren was secondary to the decisions being made there, because why else would you hit eject from that position right after you land USC and UCLA and then ultimately Washington and Oregon? That seems like you would be in a great position at that point in time, but I think he realized that this was not the best job for him necessarily, so he made the jump to the NFL. As a matter of fact, Armen, I don't blame college coaches at this point for making the jump from college to the NFL. How much more difficult has it become over the last 5 years to be a college football coach with everything new that you're having to deal with, from NIL and the transfer portal to constantly having to appease guys on your roster 24/7, 365?
You're absolutely right. I think it's, look, we're not going to cry a river for guys that are making north of $10 million a year, and a lot of defensive and offensive coordinators are making $2 and $3 million a year. But if you're just talking about the toll, the human toll, there used to be a break in these jobs, even though they were very intense for, let's say, 45 weeks a year. They had 3 or 4 weeks off where they could spend time with their family and get to know their family again. And that's just not the case anymore. It's 24/7, 365 when you deal with the portal, which I think is the real wild card here. But they're exhausted. I mean, I spent time with Jed Fish's Kevin Murphy, who is kind of his director of player personnel, and I was in his office, and he's got an office that's, it's Spartan to say the least. And all he was doing was scrolling through the list of guys in the portal because they were looking for a tackle or they were looking for a cornerback. And he goes, I just do this all day long, and then we have this whole process in place. And he had a 1-year-old daughter he had barely seen through the entire last year. Jed, who I've gotten to know, is now at Washington, married to a beautiful woman, Amber, have just 3 wonderful children. Jed finally, after the first year in Arizona, when he's trying to raise Arizona from a team that had lost 12 straight games before he got there and got crushed by Arizona State 70-7 in their territorial cup, he's just trying to build a program. The first year he was there, he said, I never saw Amber. He goes, I finally, in my second year, I had to say, okay, every day I can spend an hour with her. And what was that hour, Trey? It was 5:30 in the morning to 6:30 in the morning where he could have coffee with her. And the only reason he saw his daughters, who were young in middle school, elementary school at that time, was they would come to practice and he could see them when they were practicing. So something's got to give here. And in terms of the exhaustion level, when you see guys like Chip Kelly leave UCLA as the head coach at UCLA and take a $4 million pay cut to go become the offensive coordinator at Ohio State and say publicly, I've never been happier as a football coach because I don't have to deal with all the other BS that he was dealing with, or just the realities. It's not even BS. It's boosters. It's the collective. It's the portal. And like you said, imagine you think you have your roster set. You're coming out of spring practice. You've got, okay, I've got my backups. I got my starters. And then the next thing you know, the portal opens and 10 of your really good players, guys that you know are going to contribute in the following football season, walk into your office and say, oh, by the way, coach, if I don't get more NIL money, I'm going in the portal, and I know I'm going to make, because I got an agent now who's telling me I'm worth $500,000 on the open market, $250,000. Jed had that at Arizona, where one of his wide receivers came in and said, Coach, SC wants me. They're going to give me $250,000. He said, God bless you. Good luck. Go. I can't compete with that right now. If I pay you $250,000 as my starting wide receiver, I've blown up my locker room completely. And that's, as you alluded to, the culture and the chemistry that was kind of a given that if you could build it, it would hold, and you could build off of that to win a championship. That culture and chemistry now is like the mad scientist. You have no idea from one day to the next what your locker room is like. And look, I've been around the game long enough. Um, as I said, I'm not crying a river for these coaches, but I know how hard my job is. It was an investigative reporter or leading chief investigative correspondent network. It was hard enough to do. I can't imagine if I got hit with 4 or 5 other things that suddenly I had to worry about every single day in order before I even got a story on the air. I don't know how long I would have lasted in that job. It was hard enough on a good day, much like being a head coach at a Power Five or four school. But you throw in all these other things, these cross currents and NIL, the portal, and collectives, and having to go out and raise money now for the collectives. I think I would have, had walked out the door and not come back.
Why did Jimbo Fisher not work in College Station, Armen? He obviously has the pedigree, has the national championship under his belt. He's a Nick Saban protege, and he had all the resources imaginable, as Nick Saban so infamously complained about, which you guys do a great job of covering at the beginning of this book. So why did Jimbo not work at A&M?
That's a really good question. I think it came down to ego and arrogance and thinking that his way was the only way and not really committing. Um, Even though they got a great recruiting class and they had all that, so whatever much it cost, Jimbo said it wasn't 30 million, whatever the millions it was. Um, I just think he got a little too big for his britches. He thought that his way was the only way to get things done. He's an alpha male, much like Nick. Those are two West Virginia boys that butted heads at times. Um, you would think, given the kind of artillery that A&M has in terms of a booster network, some of the finest facilities. Kyle Field is as nice a stadium and as beautiful a stadium. I mean, they have a hotel right next to the stadium for the boosters to stay in, during their time at the games. Second to none, really, in an ability to have all the elements that you need. But Jimbo's attitude, just wore people out. And I think what happened with that recruiting class that they brought in, it really upset the locker room, the chemistry of that locker room. And, we heard a lot of stories about how much pot was being smoked down there and the discipline problems. And, Jimbo not exactly making the right decisions a priority for his players. And when you lose a locker room like that, you're not going to win games in the SEC. Not against Georgia, not against Alabama, and I think not against Mississippi this year. Ole Miss has got a really, really good team, and Lane's found himself. He's a different kind of coach, a different kind of person these days. To his ever-loving credit, Tennessee, it's going to be the war of the world down there. And I think if you don't have that chemistry in that culture, you can win 8 games, but you're not contending for a national championship.
Now, while it was ironic for Nick Saban to call out his former assistant coach like he did, because everybody had been doing it for a long time, Nick Saban was no different, and y'all do chart that just a little bit. There are some great stories that you tell about Nick Saban's desire to not just be the best, but to continue to be the best. You have a favorite example of Nick Saban's pursuit of great?
Well, there's so many, but I think the 9/11 story, if you put that in perspective,
Yeah.
understanding, I was in a plane headed to land at LaGuardia on 9/11, just around the same time the first plane hit. So I lived through that various ways. So the story goes, Nick's down there and they're having a meeting with all his coaches and stuff. And obviously the word gets out. They're playing. This is when he's at LSU, and they're going to play Auburn that weekend, and it starts to become a real issue. And somebody says, a plane has hit the World Trade Center, and Nick's remark is, according to people in the room, guys, there's some screwed up people in the world. Now, what are we going to do on offense about cover two on defense here against cover? What are we going to do on offense against cover two on defense? And it's like, it goes right back to football. And
I don't
So,
remember. I don't mean to laugh at that for the record, but
no, but you
that's
have to put it
such
in
a ridiculous
perspective in
response.
saying, I have to say, he later apologized for the remark. He said it was wrong. But if you talk about blinders, my goodness, my God, that's the ultimate in blinders as far as I'm concerned. And the fact that he had the same lunch every day. He had the same salad with turkey on it. He wore the same pair of shoes. I was with him one day. She put these shoes on. I'm like, Nick, how long have you been wearing these shoes? He had been wearing them for 10 years to practice, and they're just a pair of tennis shoes. I'm like, Nick, you can change these and get different shoes. I'm just busting his balls. And then he goes, well, I'm not going to change these shoes. These are my shoes. It's like the hat, he had to have his hat. So, I mean, you talk about a man that wanted control, Trey, and that's what he wanted. It was all about control. And when he lost control of that program after losing to Michigan and coming back from his respite in Florida at his $18 million oceanfront estate, comes in, he's got a line outside his office. And he's, normally it would be, coach, okay, what do I do? Off-season development. How do I get better? How do I get on the field? No, one after another. Coach, if I don't get more money from NIL, I'm going in the portal. I'm going in the portal. I'm going in the portal. And finally, Miss Terry, who I know pretty well over the years, they had these conversations. She goes, what are we doing here? This isn't football as we know it. It certainly isn't been like it's been for you the last 50 years. And then I think that, Nick walked away, and just kind of to close it up, when you have Jim Harbaugh on one coast staring at the Pacific Ocean from his motorhome in Huntington Beach, California, deciding whether he's going to become, well, he's already decided to become the head coach of the Chargers at the time, and he's just kicking back. And on the other coast, on the Atlantic Ocean, you got Nick Saban looking at the water going, what the hell am I doing here in college football? Neither one of them now, the two singular faces and forces arguably in college football, neither one of them in the game. That tells you pretty much all you need to know about where the chaotic state of big-time college football right now.
That is crazy. And you guys do such a fantastic job of documenting it all. For any Longhorn fans listening right now, yes, our fellow Armenian Steve Sarkisian and the Texas Longhorns get a couple of mentions as well.
Yeah, they do.
He is the great Armen Keteyian, nice enough to join me for a few minutes to talk about his excellent new book. If you're a college football fan or just a fan of the changing nature of business, I cannot recommend it enough. It's called The Price, What It Takes to Win in College Football's Era of Chaos. Armen, thank you as always for the time, man. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it was great, Trey. Good seeing you again, man. Thanks a lot.
If you're still watching or listening on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or elsewhere, would greatly appreciate you subscribing to the show. And please do like today's episode. Thanks to Gentleman Jesus for the intro and outro music. Hear more of his work at gentlemanjesus.com. Thanks to you for hanging out. For more of the show and to connect on social media, visit booksonpod.com. Talk to you next time on Books on Pod.